May 19th, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 11 days. 11 days since the guns fell silent. 11 days since the last order was given, the last bomb dropped, the last soldier told to stand down. 11 days since the world exhaled a breath it had been holding for 6 years. And on a dirt road in the middle of Saskatchewan, Canada, a young farm boy from the Prairies named Eric Jacobson was standing beside a military transport truck holding a clipboard he did not need, watching a cloud of dust rise from the horizon. He was 22 years old. He had grown up on this land. He knew every smell of every season on the Canadian plains. He knew the way the wheat moved in July, wind slow and golden like something breathing. He knew the way the sky looked at 4 in the morning before a harvest, that particular shade of deep blue that meant the day was going to be long and good and exhausting. He had never left Saskatchewan before joining the Canadian Army in 1943. He had never met a German. He was about to meet 48 of them. The transport truck groaned to a stop in front of the gates of Prairie Vista Camp, and Eric put down the clipboard and watched the canvas covering on the back of the truck shift and billow in the prairie wind. He heard voices from inside, low, uncertain. The sound of people who have been traveling for a very long time and no longer trust that any destination will be safe. The gate opened, the canvas pulled back, and what Eric saw made him forget for just a moment that these women were supposed to be the enemy. They were exhausted in a way he had never seen exhaustion before. Not the exhaustion of a long day in the fields, the pleasant ache that comes from honest work. This was something else. This was exhaustion that had settled into the bones and made a home there. It was in the hollows of their cheeks, in the gray tint of skin that had not seen proper sunlight in too long, in the way they moved, careful and small, like people who had learned not to take up too much space in the world. They were young, most of them, some barely older than Eric himself. And they were looking at Saskatchewan the way a drowning person looks at a shore they cannot quite believe is real. Because what they were seeing was wheat. An ocean of golden wheat stretching to a horizon so distant it seemed to curve with the earth itself. No buildings broke the expanse. No bomb craters scarred the fields. No burned villages dotted the landscape. No ruins. No rubble. No evidence that the world they had just come from had ever existed at all. Just grain rippling in waves under a sky so vast and blue, it felt like something sacred. One of the women said something in German that Eric did not understand. Later, when Margaret Kensington translated it for him, he stood very still for a moment. She had said, "Is this still the same planet?" Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something. If your father served in World War II, or your grandfather, or your uncle, or anyone in your family who wore a uniform during those years, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me where they served and what they came home carrying. Because the story we are about to tell today is one that connects directly to the world those men and women fought to protect. Stay with me until the 27-minute mark, because What happens when these German women see a Canadian grain elevator for the first time is something that will stop you cold. I promise you that. Now let me tell you about the woman who was waiting at the gate. Margaret Kensington was 31 years old. She was a lieutenant in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, what they called the CWA. And she had been assigned to Prairie Vista Camp 6 weeks before this transport arrived because she possessed a skill that the Canadian military valued enormously in the spring of 1945. She spoke perfect German, not textbook German, not the careful clipped German of someone who learned the language from a book or a classroom. The German she spoke was the German of kitchens and bedtime stories and Sunday dinners and arguments between parents about small, ordinary things. It was the German of a household warm and specific and alive. Her father's name was Franz. His family name before he changed it to Kensington when he arrived in Canada had been Kohler. Franz Kohler had been a professor at a university in Bavaria, a man who taught literature and believed sincerely in the power of books to make people more fully human. In 1921, Franz Kohler was told that his position at the university would be eliminated unless he joined the party. Not the Nazi Party, not yet, but the predecessor movements, the nationalist organizations that were already beginning to reshape German academic life in ways that Franz found troubling and then frightening. He refused. He lost the position. He married a woman named Katharina, who was a music teacher with a clear voice and an even clearer understanding of where things were heading. And in 1922, they packed everything they owned into 2 trunks and got on a ship. They chose Saskatchewan because of its land, because of its openness, because a country that had been built by people arriving with nothing seemed like a country that understood what it meant to start again. They came to Saskatchewan. They were given land. They planted wheat. Katharina Kensington raised her daughter Margaret in a house where German was spoken in the evenings, and English was spoken everywhere else. And she told Margaret from the time Margaret was old enough to understand Germany and the German government are not the same thing. The government will fall. Governments always fall. But the language is yours. The culture is yours. Keep it. Because someday it will matter in ways you cannot predict. Margaret had not fully understood what her mother meant until the spring of 1945, when she found herself standing at the gate of a prisoner camp in Saskatchewan, watching 48 exhausted German women climb down from a transport truck. She straightened her uniform. She walked forward, and she began to speak. The effect was immediate. Every head turned. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the wheat fields and the distant creak of the truck's cooling engine. Margaret had seen this reaction before in smaller doses during her work processing paperwork and doing preliminary interviews with German detainees. The shock of hearing their own language from the mouth of someone in a Canadian uniform. The confusion of it, the way it scrambled every assumption they had carried with them across the Atlantic. but she had never seen it on 48 faces at once. She kept her voice calm and her posture open, and she told them simply, "You are at Prairie Vista Camp. You are safe here. You will be treated according to the laws that govern the treatment of wartime detainees. You will be treated with the dignity that all people deserve." She watched the words land. She watched something shift. Not relief, not yet. These were women who had been trained by years of war not to trust that anything announced to them was true. But something loosened, some small thread of tension in the air between them. One woman near the back of the group, 25 years old, from Dresden, with dark circles under her eyes and a notebook tucked under her arm that she held, the way some people hold onto a railing on a moving ship, raised her hand the way a student raises a hand in a classroom, tentative and formal, and she asked, "Why does your German sound like someone from Hamburg?" Margaret almost smiled. "My mother is from Munich," she said, "and my father is from Bavaria. But I grew up here, so I sound like all of them and none of them." The woman with the notebook, whose name was Gudrun Lindemann, looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked out at the wheat fields. Then she looked back at Margaret, and she said very quietly, "Your parents left." It was not a question. "Yes," Margaret said, "in 1922. My father saw what was coming, and they left before leaving. Became impossible." Gudrun Lindemann nodded slowly, like someone receiving information that confirmed a calculation they had already made in their head, but hoped was wrong. Eric Jacobson, standing 20 feet away, did not understand any of this exchange. But he was watching Gudrun's face. And he understood faces the way farmers understand weather. You don't need to know the science to know what is coming. What was coming across Gudrun Lindemann's face was something he would spend years trying to find a word for. The closest he ever got was the look of a person realizing that the map they have been using is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And that all the distances they thought they understood have to be recalculated from the beginning. Let me tell you something about these 48 women before we go further, because it is important for this story to mean what it should mean to understand exactly who they were and what they had lived through to get here. They were not soldiers in the combat sense. They had never fired a weapon in battle. They were Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Stabshelferinnen and Sanitätshelferinnen and Wirtschaftshelferinnen. Communications auxiliaries, administrative assistants, medical helpers, supply coordinators. By 1944, roughly 500,000 women were serving in these auxiliary roles across the German Wehrmacht. They had been recruited initially as volunteers, then increasingly through compulsion as the war consumed more and more of the German male population. And someone had to keep the communications running, keep the files organized, keep the supply chains moving. They came from cities across Germany. They came from ordinary families, fathers who were teachers or shopkeepers or mechanics, mothers who kept house and stretched rations and tried to believe what they were told. They had been told with the full authority of the German state and its propaganda apparatus that the Allied nations were struggling, that the Americans were not as powerful as they claimed, that the Canadians and the British were suffering under their own shortages, that everyone was enduring equally, and that Germany, with its discipline and its sacrifice and its unity, would ultimately prevail. They had believed this because not believing it was dangerous, and also because from inside Germany in the last years of the war, there was no way to see that it was wrong. You cannot measure the size of a lie from inside it. These were not stupid women. They were not uniquely cruel or uniquely indifferent to the suffering around them. They were people who had been given a broken map and told it was accurate, and they had navigated by it as best they could. What was about to happen to them in the dining hall of Prairie Vista Camp was not a punishment. It was the moment the map fell apart. Among the 48, there were women whose stories would define this entire chapter of history. Elfriede Hartmann, 28 years old, from Berlin, had served as a Stabshelferin processing documents she had taught herself not to fully read. She was a watcher, a keeper of details, a woman who had learned that observation was the safest form of understanding available to someone in her position. She had a mother still in Berlin, a sister, and a nephew named Hans, who was 6 years old and whom she had not seen in close to a year. Kethe Neumann, 27 years old, had served as a Red Cross nurse in field hospitals near the Western Front. She had held screaming young men still on operating tables while surgeons worked with almost no anesthesia because the morphine had run out in 1944. She had seen things that most people never see and had learned to carry them in the specific way that medical workers carry things they cannot put down. Heidemarie Baumann, 26, from München, had worked as a medical auxiliary distributing food rations to patients, calculating with brutal precision how to keep people alive on quantities of food that were never enough. She had a specific kind of knowledge about calories and nutritional value that most people never develop because most people never need it. Ingeborg Schwarz, 29, from Stuttgart, had been a supply coordinator managing distribution chains across a wide region of southern Germany. She knew exactly how many grams of bread each German citizen was supposed to receive. She knew those numbers were wrong. She had also known what happened to people who asked questions about those numbers, and so she had not asked. Roswitha Engel, 27, from Frankfurt, had kept Wehrmacht vehicles operational through 2 years of war using ingenuity salvaged parts and a mechanical instinct that bordered on the uncanny. She thought in systems the way some people think in music, hearing the logic of things and understanding what they needed. Gerlinde Roth, also 27, a nurse from Köln, had served in military medical facilities and carried in her bearing the particular steadiness of someone who has spent years being the calmest person in a room full of people who are afraid. She was one of the few who had arrived at Prairie Vista Camp still undecided about something fundamental, though she could not yet have named what that something was. Sigrun Wolf, 21, from Hamburg, had processed food ration cards and understood numbers in the way that people who watch numbers fail understand them as a language that tells the truth, even when the people using them try to make it say something else. And Adelheid Klein, 20 from Nuremberg the youngest, had operated telegraph equipment and transmitted thousands of messages about victories that never came. She had typed those words with her own fingers and believed every one of them until the morning she did not anymore, and that morning had come without warning and changed the texture of everything that followed. These 8 women and the 40 others who climbed down from that truck were about to eat their first meal in Canada. Eric Jacobson had been helping set up for the meal since early morning. This was the part of his duties he found easiest to understand. Food was something he knew. He had grown up in a house where the table was a serious thing, where his mother put effort into every meal, not because they were wealthy, but because she believed that feeding people was one of the primary acts of love available to a human being. He carried bread from the kitchen to the tables. Real bread. Prairie Vista Camp received its rations from a supply chain rooted in the agricultural abundance of Saskatchewan, and that abundance was not something Eric had ever thought of as remarkable because he had grown up inside it. The bread was white and soft, with a golden crust that crinkled when you squeezed it. It smelled the way bread is supposed to smell, like warmth and yeast, and the particular comfort of something made by human hands from simple ingredients. He set out butter, the real kind, yellow and dense from dairy operations that had been running without interruption throughout the entire war because the war had never come here. He set out portions of meat, vegetables that had been harvested recently enough that they still held the brightness of things recently pulled from earth. He stood back and looked at the tables. It looked to him like a normal Tuesday lunch. He had no frame of reference for what it was about to look like to someone else. The dining hall was quiet when the women came in. They moved carefully still, wearing the slightly dazed expression of people whose sensory systems are trying to process more than they were designed to process in a single afternoon. They sat at the long wooden tables. They looked at the food. Heide Marie Baumann sat down and did not immediately pick up her fork. She was calculating. The single meal in front of her contained by her rapid mental arithmetic more nutritional value than most German civilians were receiving in an entire week. "It is special," she said to the woman sitting next to her. "It must be special. This cannot be what they give everyone." She said it in German, assuming she was not understood. Margaret Kensington was standing in the doorway. She heard it. She walked to the table and said in the German of her mother's kitchen, "This is the standard ration. 3 meals like this every day, as required by the Geneva Convention." Heide Marie looked at her. Then she looked at the food. Then she looked at Margaret again, and in her eyes was the expression of someone who has just been handed a proof that contradicts everything she thought she knew about the fundamental nature of the problem she has been solving. At the other end of the table, Gudrun Lindemann picked up a slice of bread. Her hands were shaking slightly. She had not seen bread like this since childhood. Before the war, when Germany had imported wheat from abroad, and bakeries had made bread the way bread was supposed to be made. She took a bite, and she began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way people cry when they are surprised by their own emotions, when something touches a place they had forgotten was still tender. She cried because the bread tasted like bread was supposed to taste. That was all. It tasted like what it was, and she had not tasted that in so long that she had stopped knowing she was missing it. Around the table, similar things were happening in different ways. Sigrun Wolf ate slowly and with complete concentration, the way people eat when they are trying to memorize something. Ingeborg Schwartz simply sat with her fork in her hand and could not begin. Adelheid Klein ate steadily and did not cry and did not stop eating. Later, when someone asked her what she had been thinking during that first meal, she said, "I was thinking about my mother's hands. She used to make bread every Saturday morning. I had forgotten what it smelled like until just now." Käthe Neumann ate quickly and then went pale and had to stop. Her stomach, which had operated on inadequate nutrition for too long, was not ready for real food. The richness of it was too much at once. Eric noticed. He was a farmer's son. He understood the relationship between a depleted body and sudden abundance, having seen it in animals that had gone through a hard winter. He went to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water and set it next to her plate without saying anything. She looked up at him. He said in the simplest English he could manage, "Eat slow. Body needs time." She did not speak English, but she understood the words and she understood his face, and she nodded. He nodded back. That was the whole exchange. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Käthe Neumann, who had seen things that most people never see and carried them in the specific way that medical workers carry things they cannot put down, felt her eyes fill with tears. Not because of the water, not because of the kindness exactly, because of the casualness of it, because he had done it without thinking the way you do something that is simply, obviously, the right thing to do. There was no performance in it, no audience, no transaction. He had seen she was struggling, and he had helped, and he had expected nothing from it. She had forgotten that was possible. Roswitha Engel set down her fork and said the thing that was vibrating in the air above every person at every table in that room. "Our families are starving," she said. "Right now in Germany, people are eating grass. People are trading their last possessions for a loaf of bread. And we are sitting here." She did not say it with anger. She said it the way you state a fact that you are still working out how to hold. Elfriede Hartmann was sitting at the far end of the table. She had not cried. She was not sure she could cry, not in this moment. Something that should have been tears felt more like pressure, like a door closed tightly against something that would eventually have to be let through. She set down her fork. She thought about her mother still in Berlin, her sister, her nephew Hans, who was 6 years old and whom she had not seen in close to a year. She thought about the ration cards that promised 200 grams of bread per person per day, when bread was available at all. She thought about what 200 grams of bread actually looked like in your hand. She thought about how that number had seemed like a given and unfortunate fact of wartime that everyone everywhere was enduring together, because that was what they had been told. She looked at the table in front of her. She thought about what she had been told. Outside, the Saskatchewan sky stretched in every direction without apology. The wheat fields caught the late afternoon light and held it gold and ancient and indifferent to everything that human beings had done to each other over the past 6 years. Eric Jacobson, on his way back to the kitchen, paused for a moment at the window. He looked out at the fields his father had planted, the fields his grandfather had broken from raw prairie decades ago, with nothing but a plow and determination, and the particular stubbornness of people who had chosen this land and decided to love it. Then he looked back at the room behind him. Then he went to get more bread, because somebody was going to need it, and it was right there. There was more than enough. There had always been more than enough. That was the thing that none of the women at those tables had been told, and that no piece of paper and no radio broadcast could have made them understand the way a single afternoon in Saskatchewan had just made them understand it. The abundance had always been here, and they had never been allowed to know. 3 weeks into their time at Prairie Vista Camp, the women began to find their rhythms. Not comfort exactly. Comfort was too large a word for what was available to them in the summer of 1945. But rhythm, the small, reliable structures that human beings build around themselves when they need to survive a stretch of time that has no clear end. Elfrida Hartman woke each morning before the others and sat at the small window beside her bunk and watched the light come up over the prairie. In Berlin, dawn had meant something practical. It meant the night had passed without a bombing raid, or it meant assessing the damage from one that had. It meant another day of work, of documents, of careful, controlled translation between what was actually happening and what was allowed to be written down. Here, dawn meant nothing except itself. The sky went from black to deep blue to something that had no name in German or English, a color that existed only in this specific geography at this specific hour. And then the sun came, and the wheat turned from silver to gold, and the whole enormous landscape simply became itself again, uncomplicated, abundant, without agenda. She found it almost unbearable some mornings, not because it was painful, because it was not. And not being painful felt after everything like something she needed to earn before she could accept it. The letters arrived on a Thursday. Marguerite Lefebvre, the camp's postal corporal, distributed them in the late afternoon with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that mail was never just mail, that every envelope carried a weight that had nothing to do with the paper inside it. Her French-Canadian accent softened the edges of the English words she used when she handed each letter over, as if she could cushion the contents by the manner of delivery. 14 of the 48 women received correspondence. The others sat in the common room and did not watch. Ingeborg Schwartz held her letter from Stuttgart with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic crossing, and had not started again since, which she had chosen to interpret as steadiness rather than numbness. The letter was from her younger sister, Monica. It was written on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. The ink was pale. Diluted Ingeborg understood immediately to make the supply last longer. She read it once quickly, then she read it again slowly. Then she set it on the table and said in the flat tone of someone reporting a fact, rather than expressing an emotion, "She is lying. Every single word is a lie designed to spare me worry." Gudrun looked up from her own letter, her eyes already red. "Mine too. My mother writes that they are comfortable, that food is adequate, that the rebuilding is going well." She almost laughed. The sound that came out was close to a laugh, but was not one. "Everyone knows what Dresden looks like now," she said. "There is no rebuilding. There is only survival. She is writing me a fairy tale because she thinks that is what I need." Käthe Neumann held a letter from her brother without opening it for a long time. Her brother had lost his right arm at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 and 1943. He had survived things that had not been survived by the majority of the men around him, and he had come home changed in ways that went well beyond the physical. And he had still managed to build something like a life in the ruins of post-war Germany. He was, in Käthe's assessment, one of the stronger people she had ever known. His letter was cheerful. It spoke of finding work, of community, of hope for the future. Not a word about the black market that had absorbed whatever wealth the family had left. Not a word about the former soldiers she knew were begging on the streets of German cities because there was nothing else available to them. "He is protecting me," Käthe said quietly. "He thinks if he tells me how bad it is, I will be unable to bear it. So he tells me a story instead." Gerlinde Roth, the nurse from Köln, sat quietly in the corner of the room and said nothing. She was one of the few who had not yet decided about something fundamental, and she understood, listening to the others read their letters aloud, that whatever she was waiting to decide was getting closer. Heidemarie Baumann, who had received no letter at all, sat beside Käthe and said what had become apparent to everyone in the room. "They are all doing it, all of them. They are lying to protect us because they love us, and they don't understand that we already know." Because they did know. Prairie Vista Camp received Canadian newspapers, and Canadian newspapers did not operate under the restrictions of a wartime propaganda ministry. The photographs published in those papers showed German cities with a directness that the German press had never permitted. Rubble measured in city blocks. Civilians in lines for food that ran around corners and down streets, and sometimes had no end because the food ran out before the line did. Roswitha Engel stood and walked to the window. Her letter mentioned in passing that her nephew was small for his age. She had read that line 4 times. Small, she said to no one in particular. She means starving. She means his body is not developing the way a child's body should develop because he has not had enough to eat. But she cannot write those words. So she says small. Adelheid Klein, the youngest, said the thing that had been forming in the room all afternoon. They are lying to protect us, she said. We have been lying to ourselves to protect our sanity. And Germany lied to all of us to protect a government that should have fallen long before it did. Everything has been built on lies. And we can only see that now because we are standing in a place where the truth is visible from every window. No one disagreed. Outside, the Saskatchewan wheat moved in the evening wind, honest and indifferent and completely unconcerned with the weight of what had just been understood inside that room. Ketha Neumann stopped sleeping. This was not in the clinical sense insomnia. She fell asleep without difficulty each night. But she woke consistently between 2 and 3 in the morning, with her heart moving too fast and her chest too tight, and the particular disorientation of someone who has surfaced from one reality into another and cannot immediately locate themselves in either. On the 8th night, she gave up trying to make herself stay in the bunk and went outside. Eric Jacobson was on the overnight watch. He nodded at her when she came through the door. He did not stop her. Everyone in the camp understood that there was nowhere to go. The prairie at night was not a place you escaped into. It was a place that simply absorbed you. She walked to the fence line and stopped. The sky above her was extraordinary. The moon was nearly full and casting actual shadows across the grass. The stars were so dense and so bright that they looked structural, like something holding the darkness up rather than merely decorating it. And it went on in every direction without stopping. Ketha felt her breathing change. Not slow down, speed up. Her body was sending signals that were appropriate for a basement in Cologne in 1944, when the anti-aircraft guns started up and the floor vibrated, and you lay flat and waited not for the all clear, but simply for another minute in which you were still alive. She was standing in open air, in a safe place, under a beautiful sky, and she was panicking. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate footsteps. Eric approaching the way you approach something you do not want to startle. He stopped beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she said in the small amount of English she had accumulated in 3 weeks, "Too big. The sky. Cannot breathe." He looked up at the sky she was pointing at. He looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they have seen every night of their life and have therefore stopped seeing. Then he looked at it again, this time trying to see it the way she was seeing it. It took him a moment. Then he sat down on the grass. Just sat down, right there in the middle of his overnight watch in his uniform on the damp grass of the camp's perimeter, and looked up. He pointed to the ground beside him. She hesitated. Then she sat down too. They sat there for 20 minutes without speaking. The sky turned very slowly above them, The wheat fields made their soft sound in the distance. The temperature dropped another degree and neither of them moved. When Ketha finally stood up to go back inside, her breathing had settled to something close to normal. Not because anything had been explained or resolved, but because someone had sat down in the large, frightening space beside her and stayed there, and that had been enough. Eric Jacobson, walking his perimeter again after she went in, found himself thinking about something his father had said once during a particularly brutal winter storm when the two of them had been out in the barn making sure the animals were secured. His father had said, "The sky does not care what you think of it. It is just the sky. Your job is to get used to it." He had not understood at the time what his father meant by that. He thought he was beginning to understand now. 3 weeks after that night, Eric brought a proposal to the group. He had discussed it with Captain Wallace Pemberton, the officer in charge of Prairie Vista Camp, a 45-year-old career military man from Ontario who managed the camp with the combination of procedural rigidity and quiet practicality that characterized the best administrators of that era. Pemberton had approved the proposal with the standard conditions attached. Eric stood in front of the assembled women and explained it simply with Margaret translating beside him. There was a plot of land behind the barracks. No one was using it. Seeds were available. Tools were available. If anyone wanted to tend a garden on a completely voluntary basis, the resources were there. Roswitha Engel raised her hand before he finished the sentence. Then Sigrun. Then Adelheid. Within 2 minutes, nearly every woman in the room had indicated she wanted to participate. The next morning, Eric arrived with spades and trowels and a wheelbarrow full of dark Saskatchewan soil, and the women came out into the early morning light and stood looking at the empty plot of ground, the way people look at something they have been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting for it. Elfrida Hartman knelt down and pressed both hands into the earth. It gave under her palms, soft and rich and full of the particular warmth that soil holds close to the surface on a summer morning. She could smell it, that deep, clean smell of earth that has not been disturbed in a while, dark and alive, and completely unlike anything she had put her hands into in Berlin. In Berlin's wartime gardens, the improvised spaces between rubble where people tried to grow food to supplement their rations, the soil had been gray and compacted and mixed with brick dust and ash. Things grew in it because things grow wherever they possibly can, but they grew small and bitter and tasting of smoke. This soil had never known any of that. Gudrun, kneeling beside her, ran a handful through her fingers and let it fall. In Dresden, she said quietly, we tried to grow potatoes in the rubble. The soil was brick dust and ash. Nothing grew properly. Everything tasted like smoke. This has never been bombed, Elfrida said. Gudrun looked at the soil in her hands. Then she looked at the fields beyond the camp fence. Then she looked at Elfrida. None of it has she said. Not 1 inch of it. Eric watched the way they handled the soil. There was something in it that he recognized from his own life, from the particular relationship that people who work land develop with earth itself. Not sentiment exactly, something more specific than that. A kind of attention, a kind of respect. He thought they know what this is. They have just not had access to it for a very long time. By midday, the plot had been transformed. Neat rows, planted seeds, small wooden stakes marking each section. The women stood back and looked at what they had made, and something moved across all of their faces at roughly the same time, something that Eric identified immediately because he had been born to it and grown up inside it. It was the feeling of having put something in the ground that was going to grow. He did not know a word for it in German, but he recognized it the way you recognize a piece of music you have heard before in a different key. The following Saturday, while Elfrida, Gudrun, and Sigrun were working on a fence repair detail at the Thorvaldsen property, a supervised work program that Pemberton had approved in coordination with local farmers, Beatrice Thorvaldsen appeared. She was 12 years old, with blonde braids and the direct gaze of a child who had been raised around adults who said what they meant and expected the same in return. She walked toward the three women without hesitation, as if there were nothing unusual about approaching German detainees in the middle of a Saskatchewan field, because as far as Beatrice was concerned, there was not. She stopped in front of Elfrida and said without preamble, "Why did Germany start the war?" Sergeant McTavish, who was supervising the work detail from a distance, heard the question and made no move to intervene. He simply watched. Gudrun set down the fence post she was holding and knelt to the girl's level. "We were told," she said, slowly choosing words that a child could follow, "that Germany was surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy us. We were told that we had to fight or be destroyed. Many people believed this because they were afraid, and because the people telling them had a great deal of authority. But Canada never attacked Germany," Beatrice said. Her logic was simple and completely unanswerable. "We are very far away. Why would we want to destroy you?" Sigrun Wolf made a sound that was almost a laugh. "An excellent question," she said. "One we should have asked ourselves." "Did you want to fight?" Beatrice pressed. Elfrida set down the tool she was holding. "I did not want to fight," she said. "I wanted to serve my country, which I thought meant protecting my family and my home. I did not understand until much later that I was serving something very different." "What were you protecting them from?" Gudrun was quiet for a moment. "Lies," she said finally. "We were protecting lies. We just did not know it at the time." Beatrice considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "My teacher," she said, "is German, Mrs. Fairchild. Her family came here in 1933. She says they left because they could see what was coming and did not want to be part of it." Another family, Elfrida thought. Another set of people who had seen the truth, while the rest of them stood inside the lie, convinced it was the whole world. "My teacher says," Beatrice continued, "that people who do bad things always think they are doing good things. She says that is what makes them dangerous." not that they are evil, but that they are certain they are right. The words landed differently than the girl could have intended, because they were not an accusation. They were simply an observation offered with the clarity that children have before they learn to soften things. And in their simplicity, they reached a place that no adult argument had yet been able to reach. They had not been evil. They had been certain. And their certainty had made them something far more dangerous than evil, because evil at least knows what it is. Your teacher is very wise, Elfrida said. Do you hate us? Sigrun asked suddenly. Beatrice shook her head. My father says hate is for people who do not have enough work to do. He says, if you are busy helping things grow, you do not have time to hate. She paused and looked at the fence they had been repairing at the field behind it, at the tools in their hands. Are you helping things grow now? Gudrun smiled despite the tears in her eyes. We are trying to, she said. Yes, then I think you are doing good things now, Beatrice said, with the absolute certainty that only children possess, even if you did not before. She walked back toward the farmhouse without looking back, as if the matter were settled. And in some way that none of them could have fully articulated it was. In August, Captain Pemberton organized a work detail to the local grain elevator. 8 women with administrative and clerical experience were selected to assist with inventory documentation. The facility needed its records organized, and it was practical, useful work that suited their skills. Ingeborg Schwartz was among the 8. The grain elevator rose against the prairie sky like something from another scale of existence. Concrete and massive and completely functional, without any of the architectural pretension of buildings designed to impress. It was designed to hold a specific quantity of grain, and it did that, and it asked for nothing else from the world. Ingeborg was in the first group through the door. She stopped walking 3 steps inside. The interior space was enormous. Cylindrical chambers rising to heights that seemed excessive until you understood what they were for. Each chamber filled with grain. The smell hit her before anything else, that dense, warm, almost sweet smell of stored wheat in large quantities, a smell that has no equivalent in human experience, except perhaps the smell of money, which it effectively was measured in a different currency. She heard Margaret's voice somewhere behind her reading from the facility records in response to a question someone had asked. This elevator can store approximately 2 million bushels, currently holding approximately 1.7 million. Ingeborg's mind ran the conversion automatically. 1.7 million bushels, 46,000 metric tons of wheat, 46,000 in one building, in one small town. In one province of a country that had several such provinces, each with multiple such towns, each with multiple such elevators. She had been the supply coordinator for a district in Stuttgart. She had calculated every single day how to distribute an inadequate supply of food across a population that needed more than existed. She had made decisions about who received what and in what quantities, and those decisions had consequences
that she had trained herself not to follow all the way to their ends, because following them all the way to their ends was not compatible with continuing to function.
She had believed because she had been told, and because there was no visible evidence to the contrary, that this was the condition of everyone. That the scarcity she was managing was universal. She leaned her back against the wall and slowly lowered herself to sit on the floor, her legs no longer reliable. All those children, she said. Her voice was almost inaudible. All those families. I told them there was nothing more. I believed we were all suffering equally. But this has always been here. While we were dying, this was here. Elfrida and Heidemarie knelt beside her. Margaret approached carefully. The scarcity in Germany was not natural, she said. Your government chose to produce weapons instead of food, chose military expansion over feeding its own people. This abundance was not hidden from you to be cruel. It was the result of different choices made by different people. But we did not know we had a choice, Ingeborg said. We thought sacrifice was universal. We thought we were all suffering equally and that our suffering had a purpose. She looked up at the grain rising in the chambers above her. We were suffering alone, she said, and the purpose was someone else's. Eric Jacobson was standing in the doorway. He had grown up less than 30 miles from this grain elevator. He had watched trucks roll in and out of it his entire life. He had understood it as furniture, as simply part of the landscape of his existence, no more remarkable than the road or the sky. He thought about his father loading grain into a truck on a morning in September and complaining mildly about the price per bushel and what it meant for the year's margin. He thought about 46,000 metric tons. He thought about 200 grams of bread. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he went to find Sergeant McTavish and told him in the straightforward way of someone reporting a practical problem that the work detail probably needed to be cut short today. The women had seen what they came to see. They needed time to sit with it. McTavish, who had his own particular kind of intelligence about human situations, agreed without asking for elaboration. They drove back to Prairie Vista Camp in a truck that was very quiet. The wheat fields passed on either side of the road, golden and enormous and real. November came to Saskatchewan the way it always does, without apology and without gradual preparation. One morning, the sky was the particular cold blue of late October, and the next morning, it was the flat white of a world that has decided to be serious. The wheat fields, stripped bare from harvest, lay in long, dark rows under the first real snow, and the wind that crossed them had nothing to slow it down for 100 miles in any direction. The formal announcement came on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. Captain Pemberton stood before the assembled group, and Margaret translated beside him, and he told them what the administrative machinery of the post-war world had determined. Transportation to Hamburg would be arranged for December 15th. Those who wished to return should submit their names by the end of the current week.
Those who wish to request permission to remain in Canada should also submit their names, as that process had its own requirements and its own timeline.
He said it clearly and without editorial comment. Then he left the room and left the decision in it. The room stayed quiet for a long time. The letters that arrived in the last week of November changed everything. 23 envelopes, more than any previous delivery. Marguerite Lefebvre distributed them with the same quiet care she always brought to this task. But her eyes moved differently this time, checking faces as she handed each envelope over the way experienced medical workers check for signs of shock in people who have not yet realized they are injured. Ketha Neumann received a letter that was not from her brother. It was from a neighbor, a woman who had lived 2 doors down from the Neumann family in Cologne since before the war, who had known Ketha since she was a child, who had written in the careful handwriting of someone who has spent a long time deciding how to say what needs to be said. Ketha's brother had died in October. He had survived Stalingrad. He had lost his arm at Stalingrad. He had come home from Stalingrad and built something from the wreckage of what the war had left him, and done it with a stubbornness and a humor that Ketha had admired more than she had ever told him. And then, in October of 1945, 5 months after the war ended, he had simply grown too weak to continue. His body, which had been running on insufficient nutrition since before his discharge, had reached a point from which it could not recover. There had been no medical care available. There had been nothing available. He had been buried in a mass grave because individual plots were no longer possible. Ketha read the letter in the common room. Then she set it on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing an object that might break. Then she stood up and walked outside without her coat. Margaret found her 20 minutes later, standing in the snow at the fence line, looking at nothing in particular. The temperature was well below freezing. Ketha appeared not to have noticed. He survived Stalingrad, Ketha said. She said it in German because in moments like this, the other language had no access to what was inside her. He lost his arm, and he survived Stalingrad, and he came home, and he died because there was not enough food to keep him alive. 5 months after the war ended. 5 months. Margaret stood beside her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not be a reduction of what had been said. After a long time, Ketha said, "If I go back, I am going back to a grave I cannot locate." She looked at Margaret. "Tell me why I should go back." Margaret did not answer immediately, not because she did not have thoughts on the subject, but because she understood that this was not a question that wanted an answer. It was a question that wanted to be heard. "I cannot tell you what to do," Margaret said finally. "I can tell you what my mother told me, which is that wherever you are, you choose what you plant, and you are responsible for what grows from it." She paused. "My mother would say, you can plant in grief, or you can plant in hope, but you have to plant somewhere, or nothing grows at all." Ketha stood in the snow for another minute. Then she turned and went back inside.
She submitted her name the following morning in the column for those requesting permission to remain. Adelheid Klein received a letter from her father. It was 4 sentences. The handwriting was her father's, but it looked different than she remembered, smaller and more compressed, the handwriting of a man trying to make what he has to say take up as little space as possible.
He wrote, "Do not come home. There is nothing here for you. Your mother and I are living in a basement with other families. Build a life somewhere that still has a future." Her father had encouraged her to join the auxiliary corps. He had stood at the door of their house in Nuremberg and watched her leave in her uniform and told her he was proud. He had believed genuinely and completely in the cause she was going to serve.
He was now telling her in 4 sentences not to come back to the country that cause had built. Adelheid folded the letter very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, the one closest to her chest, where she carried it for the rest of her time at Prairie Vista Camp, and as far as anyone who knew her later in her life could determine for a long time after that. She submitted her name in the column for those requesting to remain. The worst was not a letter at all. Ingeborg Schwartz received a document from the International Red Cross. It was formal and precise, and written in the specific language that organizations use when they are delivering information that no available language is adequate for. Records indicated that her mother, her sister, and her sister's 2 children had been killed in the Allied bombing of Stuttgart in March of 1945. The month before the war ended, Ingeborg showed the document to Elfrida without speaking. There was nothing to say. Elfrida read it and held Ingeborg while she understood what she had just read, and they stayed like that for a while in the common room, with the winter light coming through the windows and the stove making its small sounds in the corner. Then Ingeborg sat up and dried her face with the back of her hand and said in a voice that was completely steady in the particular way that voices become completely steady when a person has passed through something and come out the other side of it. "I do not have a home to return to. I have a city with different people in it who do not know me and will not want me." She looked at her hands. She said, "I will stay." A week before the departure date, on a Sunday evening when the cold had settled in hard and the sky was that particular dark blue that comes just before a Saskatchewan winter night goes fully black, Opal Thorvaldsen arrived at Prairie Vista Camp with a covered dish and a simple invitation. 6 women were asked to dinner. Elfrida Gudrun Heidemarie Sigrun Roswitha and Gerlinda Roth, who had worked the harvest and repaired fences and planted the garden and become in the particular way that shared labor creates its own kind of kinship, something that Opal thought of as people she knew.
The farmhouse was warm in the specific way that farmhouses are warm when they have been heated by people living in them for generations. A warmth that has nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with what has accumulated inside the wall.
Roasted chicken sat in the center of the table. Mashed potatoes with real butter. Gravy.
Fresh bread. carrots that Beatrice had pulled from the root cellar that afternoon. And at the end of the meal, an apple pie with cream that Opal had been making the same way her mother had made it on a Sunday in autumn for as long as she could remember. Beatrice sat at the table and talked about the school Christmas pageant with the comfortable assumption that everyone present was interested, which, as it turned out, everyone was. Clifford Thorvaldsen said grace before the meal. He was not a man who used many words when fewer would do, and his grace reflected this. Lord, he said, we thank you for this food, for this company, and for the chance to share what we have been given with people who need it. Help us build bridges where there were walls. Amen. When the meal was finished, and the pie was gone, and the coffee had been poured, and the conversation had found the slower, easier rhythm that comes after good food among people who have stopped performing and simply settled into being present. Gudrun asked the question that had been forming in all of them since the first day. Why are you being kind to us? Opal set down her cup and thought about the question the way she thought about most things, which was carefully and without rushing toward an answer just to fill the silence. My grandfather, she said, finally came here from Norway with nothing. 2 trunks and a name and the address of a man who had agreed to let him work in exchange for a piece of land. The man had no particular reason to help him. They had never met. They shared no language and no history. But he helped anyway, because that was the custom here in those years. You helped people who came with nothing, because at some point, everyone had come with nothing. She looked around the table. My grandfather taught my father that we are stewards of what we have, not owners of it. That the land does not belong to us. We belong to it for the time we are on it. And while we are on it, our responsibility is to share what it gives us. Not because it is required, because it is right. Heidemarie said quietly, but we were your enemies. Clifford looked up from his coffee. You were soldiers in a war you did not choose and could not stop, he said. The war is over. What you are now is what you decide to be, and what you decide to be is yours to determine, not mine. He set down his cup. Roswitha looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Opal. Then she looked at her own hands on the table, the mechanic's hands that had spent years keeping broken things from completely falling apart. She thought about what it might mean to spend the rest of them helping things work the way they were supposed to. Before the women left that evening, Opal took Elfriede aside at the door. The offer I made you some weeks ago, she said. It still stands. Room and board and fair wages. Year-round work, not just harvest. We need someone reliable, and you have been reliable every day since you arrived. Elfriede looked at her. It is not charity, Opal said. It is employment. There is a difference, and I mean the difference. I know, Elfriede said. And yes, the answer is yes. She walked back to camp under a sky full of stars, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, the lights of the Thorvaldsen farmhouse fading behind her. She thought about the word yes and what it contained. All the things she was saying yes to, and all the things she was saying goodbye to, and the particular weight of both of those at the same time. She thought about her mother in Berlin. She thought about Hans, who was 6 years old, and whom she hoped was still alive, and whom she would write to, and send money to, and try to bring here someday, if someday ever arrived. She thought about a crust of bread and a pair of hands that had held it like something sacred. She kept walking. By the first week of December 32, women had submitted names in the column for remaining. 16 had submitted names for the return transport. The process of finding Canadian sponsors moved faster than anyone had anticipated, which was itself a kind of answer to a question that no one had formally asked. Opal Thorvaldsen formalized the offer to Elfrida. Mrs. Beryl Fairchild arranged sponsorship for Gudrun and assistance enrolling at the Regional Teachers College, telling Gudrun that Germany had lost enough good teachers already, and she had no intention of letting another one go to waste. Dr. Robert Hayes made arrangements for Haida Marie to work as a medical assistant while she studied for Canadian nursing certification, telling her that she had the instincts already and the paperwork would take 2 years, and he would help her with the paperwork. Harold Jensen, the local mechanic who was getting older and whose son had moved to Vancouver, interviewed Roswitha by handing her a wrench and pointing at an engine that had been giving him trouble for 3 weeks. She fixed it in 40 minutes. He offered her the position on the spot. The town meeting that Beryl Fairchild organized in early December was not a smooth or comfortable affair. Harold Merchant sat in the front row and said nothing. He had come, which Pemberton had not expected. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and listened to Beryl Fairchild and Father Ignatius Brennan and Opal Thorvaldsen and Dr. Hayes make their various arguments, and he listened to the people who agreed with him make theirs. And he listened to Eric Jacobson, who was not a natural public speaker, but who said simply and without elaboration that he had worked alongside these women, and that in his experience working alongside someone was the most accurate way to know who they were. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Harold Merchant left without speaking. He went to Pemberton's office the following morning. He sat down in the chair across from Pemberton's desk and he said, "My brother's name was Robert. He was 22 years old. He was shot in the face in Holland on April 17th, 3 weeks before they surrendered." Pemberton waited. "I cannot forgive," Harold said. "I want to say I can and I cannot. I have tried to understand what forgiveness would feel like, and I cannot locate it. Maybe it comes later. Maybe it does not come at all." He looked at the desk. "But I can get out of the way," he said, "of the people who can. I can decide that my inability to forgive is my problem and not theirs, and not impose it on what they are trying to do." He stood up. "That is all I have," he said. "I hope it is enough." Pemberton, who had been in the army for 20 years and had developed a working understanding of courage in its various forms, said that he thought it was more than enough. Harold Merchant nodded once and left.
He did not attend the farewell on December 15th, but he sent a box of groceries through Marguerite Lefebvre addressed to the women who were traveling. It contained bread and dried fruit and a note that said only for the journey. No one ever confirmed it was from him. No one needed to. December 15th came clear and cold. The transport truck arrived at 8 in the morning, engine running, exhaust rising in white clouds in the frozen air. Sergeant McTavish supervised the loading of luggage with the particular care of a man who understood that he was handling something more significant than bags. The farewell in the common room lasted an hour. It was not orderly. There was no schedule for it and no protocol. Women who had arrived as strangers and become something for which the available words were inadequate moved through the room, finding each other, saying the things that needed to be said, holding on longer than military decorum technically permitted, and being permitted to do so anyway, because Pemberton had decided without announcing the decision that this was a moment in which decorum could wait. Gerlinda Roth, who was returning to Cone, held Haida Marie's hands and said, "You are making the right choice for you. I am making the right choice for me. There is no wrong answer here. There are only different answers that lead to different places." Haida Marie said, "Promise me you will write. Promise me you will tell me if Germany becomes worth returning to." "I will write," Gerlinda said. "And when Germany is worth returning to, you will already know. You will feel it from here." Uda Schultz, the mechanic from Frankfurt, embraced Roswitha. They stood there for a moment, two women who had spent years keeping broken machinery alive, who had understood each other immediately and completely from the first day. "Your family needs you," Roswitha said. "They do," Uta agreed, "and they are going to get more than they bargained for." Roswitha laughed. It was a real laugh, uncomplicated, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and is better for that. Margaret Kensington addressed the departing women in German. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was visible as an effort, which made it more rather than less moving. "You came here as prisoners," she said. "You leave as women who have confronted difficult truths and chosen to carry them. Whatever you find in Germany, whatever you help to build there, remember that you have seen what is possible when people choose cooperation over hatred. Carry that. Let it be the thing that does not get lost." The 16 women who were leaving climbed into the truck one by one. They did not look back, not because they did not care, because looking back at that particular moment, at those particular faces, would have unmade something in them that they needed to keep intact for what was coming. The truck moved down the road and became smaller, and then became a shape, and then became a memory. The 32 who remained stood in the cold until it was gone. Then they went inside. There was work to do. 23 years passed. The way time passes when you have committed to a place and a life, not quickly and not slowly, but with the particular fullness of years that are actually lived rather than endured. Seasons, harvests, children.
the ordinary accumulation of a life built deliberately in chosen soil. September 1968, Saskatchewan. Elfrida Hartman. Thorvaldsen was 51 years old and standing in her kitchen making preserves from the garden she had tended every summer since her first summer here. Her hands moved with the efficiency of long practice. She knew this kitchen the way she had once known the inside of that transport truck, which is the way you know any space that has become the container for a significant portion of your life. The light at different hours, the sounds the floor made, the particular smell of the pantry in late summer when the jars from the previous year's preserving were finally running low. Through the window, the wheat fields stretched to the horizon. She no longer feared them. She had not feared them for a very long time. She could not remember exactly when the fear had become familiarity, because it had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most important changes happen gradually and then completely, until one morning you look at the thing that once frightened you and find only the thing itself without the fear around it. Her daughter Catherine was 16 years old and standing at the sink washing mason jars. She had been born in Saskatchewan, which meant she had been born into everything that Elfrida had chosen and worked for, and she wore it the way people wear things they did not have to fight for naturally, without particular consciousness of it. A letter had arrived that morning from Gudrun, who was now Dr. Gudrun Lindemann Fairchild, who taught linguistics at the University of Saskatchewan, and had married and built a life so fully inhabiting of this place that her German accent, which had once been the primary evidence of where she came from, had become something her students sometimes forgot she had. Gudrun wrote about a reunion she was organizing. 17 of the original 32 were still in the province. 3 had moved elsewhere in Canada. 2 had died. 10 were doing things that would not have been predictable from the women who had stepped off that transport truck in May of 1945, which was the most accurate measure of how much time had actually passed. Heidemarie Baumann was the head nurse at the regional hospital. Dr. Hayes had retired the previous year and told anyone who asked that she was the best thing to come out of his entire career. Roswitha Engel owned the garage where she had once been an employee, her mechanical expertise so widely respected that farmers drove 2 counties over just to have her look at their equipment. Ingeborg Schwartz had married a widowed farmer named Thomas Brandt 4 years after the war and raised his 3 children as her own. And those children were now adults with children of their own who called her Oma and meant it in the complete way that word is meant when it is earned rather than simply inherited. There was also a letter from Gerlinde, who had returned to Köln and spent 20 years rebuilding healthcare infrastructure in a country that had to rebuild everything. Gerlinde wrote about a Germany that was becoming slowly and with great difficulty, something that neither of them would have recognized from inside the war. Democratic, accountable, populated by a younger generation that had decided with a clarity that sometimes astonished their parents that it would not repeat
what had been done on their behalf.
Two women, two choices made on the same December morning in 1945. Two different soils, two different harvests. Both real, both good. Both the result of the same fundamental decision, which was not the decision about where to go, but the decision to keep planting. Catherine turned from the sink and said in the direct way that 16-year-olds ask questions because they have not yet learned the social protocols that make adults talk around things. Was it hard, Mom, choosing to stay?
Elfrida set down the jar she was holding. She looked out the window. She looked at the wheat fields that had once been an ocean of overwhelming strangeness and were now simply the view from her kitchen on a September morning in her life.
It was the hardest and the easiest decision I ever made, she said. Hard, because it meant accepting that everything I believed was false. That the map I had been given was wrong, and I had used it anyway, and the consequences of that were real. Accepting that took longer than a single decision. It took years. She paused. Easy because the alternative was returning to a place where I would have starved. Not just physically. There is another kind of starvation that happens when the story you have been living turns out to be a lie. You can starve from that in ways that have nothing to do with food. She thought about May 19th, 1945. The transport truck. The moment the canvas pulled back. The wheat. I chose to plant seeds in soil that had never been poisoned, she said. Some of the women who went back planted seeds in German soil. And from what Gerlinda tells me, those seeds grew too. We made different choices. But all of us chose to plant rather than to stop. That is the thing that mattered. Not where, just that. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father told me once, in that first autumn here, that his grandfather used to say, the land does not care about your reasons for planting. It only responds to whether you plant or not. Elfrida looked at her daughter, at the girl who had been born here, who had grown up in the life that a series of choices and a Canadian farm family's generosity and a young soldier's decision to sit down in the grass at 2 a.m. had made possible. His grandfather was a wise man, Elfrida said. He was a farmer, Catherine said, as if this were a sufficient explanation. Elfrida considered that. Yes, she said. I suppose those are sometimes the same thing. Eric Jacobson farmed the land his father had farmed, and his grandfather had broken from raw prairie. He married in 1948, a woman from a farm 2 townships over, whose family had come from Ukraine, and who understood without needing to be told what it meant to have come from somewhere else and chosen this place. They had 3 children, 7 grandchildren. A farm that was larger than his grandfather's, but worked with the same fundamental respect for what the land required of the people who depended on it. Every December, without particular ceremony, he told his children the story of the winter of 1945. The 48 women, the bread, the night at the fence line with the woman who was afraid of the open sky, the grain elevator, the farewell in the snow, the box of groceries with no name on it. His son, a practical and somewhat impatient man, who had inherited his grandfather's stubbornness along with his farming ability, asked him once, "Do you regret it, helping them stay?" Eric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Regret helping someone who was hungry. Eat regret sitting down in the grass next to someone who was scared. Regret letting people plant things in ground that was not being used." His son said nothing. "Those are not the kinds of things you regret," Eric said. "Those are the kinds of things you hold on to when everything else gets complicated. The kind of things that remind you what you actually are when you stop performing who you think you are supposed to be." He looked out over his fields. The wheat was moving in the December wind, that slow golden wave he had watched his entire life, the same wave those 48 women had seen for the first time through the back of a transport truck in May of 1945 and could not believe was real. It was real. It had always been real. It had been real every single day that they had been told it was not. That was the thing worth remembering. That was the thing worth passing down. Not the victory, not the defeat, not the politics or the propaganda or the machinery of the war that had brought all of them to that particular dirt road in Saskatchewan on a particular morning in May. Just the wheat, just the bread, just the sky that was too large for someone who had only ever known the sky in pieces. Just a young man sitting down in the grass in the middle of the night because someone was afraid and he did not know what else to do. Elfrida Hartman Thorvaldsen lived until 1991. She watched the Berlin Wall come down on a television in her Saskatchewan kitchen and sat very still for a long time afterward. Then she called Gerlinde in Köln, and they talked for 2 hours, and at the end of the call, Gerlinde said, "Your mother was right, you know. The government fell. The culture remained." And Elfrida said, "Your mother would have said the same thing. They all knew. The ones who got out early. They all knew what it was before the rest of us could see it." And Gerlinde said, "We see it now." And Elfrida said, "Yes, finally, we see it now." She planted her garden the following spring, the same as every spring, in the same soil she had pressed her hands into for the first time in the summer of 1945, and found to be soft and dark and full of things that wanted to grow. She planted it because that is what you do. Because the land does not ask about your history. It only asks whether you are going to plant or not. And for 46 years in every season that the Saskatchewan earth allowed it, Elfrida Hartman Thorvaldsen planted. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you of something your father or your grandfather told you about those years, about the men and women they served alongside, or the people they encountered in ways they never expected, leave a comment below and tell us about it. Those stories belong in this conversation. The people who lived through that era understood something about decency and hard work.
and the particular courage it takes to choose kindness when hatred would be easier. That understanding does not expire. It does not go out of date. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.